Baby Jesus, born of the Virgin Mary, entered into the world in the most unlikely of ways. He was the fulfillment of countless prophecies from the Old Testament, something that you would think the religious leaders of the day, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, should have recognized. They were very well versed in Scripture, and they knew all the signs to look for. Yet the way he came took them all by surprise. He didn't come as their king as they had hoped. Instead, he came as a humble servant, one who had compassion on the lost and the hurting. Jesus' model of compassion is clearly seen throughout the Gospels. Luke 4:16 through 21 tells us that Jesus went into the synagogue and read from the prophet Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." He then told them that he was the fulfillment of that scripture. Because of his mission, Jesus was often misunderstood by the religious leaders of the day. This is very clearly seen in the story of Jesus calling Matthew, a tax collector, to be one of his disciples. Matthew invited Jesus to his house for a big feast. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record that many tax collectors and sinners came to eat with him, and Jesus reclined with them. In order to get a picture of the scene, you first need to understand what a tax collector was in those days. The Jews in Jesus' day were living under harsh Roman oppression. The tax collectors were Jews by birth, but they chose to work for the Roman government, and they were known for gouging the Jews of their money to make themselves rich. So the Jews considered them traitors, and they were not well liked at all. So when Jesus decided to hang out with them, the Pharisees questioned his disciples why he was doing that. They would never be caught dead hanging out with such people. Jesus heard them talking and answered them, saying in Matthew 9:12 through 13, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." The New American Standard Version says, "I desire compassion and not sacrifice." The Greek word for compassion is eleos, and Strong's Concordance defines it as mercy, kindness, or goodwill towards the miserable and the afflicted, joined with a desire to help them. This is what Jesus was all about, but the Pharisees didn't understand. You see, the Pharisees had developed a system of 613 laws, 365 of which were negative commands and 248 that were positive. This is in stark contrast to the 10 commandments God gave Moses, which Jesus summed up into 2 commandments in Matthew 22:37 through 40, when he said, the first is to love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Dr. Joseph Stoll talks about the flaws in the Pharisees' commands in his book, Fan the Flame. They created a false standard of righteousness by focusing on the externals rather than the heart, which led to a judgmental spirit within them. Their many commands were also very burdensome to the Jews. As the religious leaders of the day, they should have been the ones ministering to those who were hurting and struggling. But they were so wrapped up in following their laws, they missed the whole point of it. Dr. Stoll says that by the time Christ came, their laws had produced a heartless, cold, and arrogant brand of righteousness. In fact, Jesus confronted them in Matthew 23:27 through 28, saying, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of dead men's bones and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness." Luke 18:9 through 14 records a parable Jesus told that showed the heart of the Pharisees. He talks about a Pharisee and a tax collector praying in the temple. The Pharisee stood up and thanked God that he is not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or like the tax collector standing nearby. He boasted of his good deeds in prayer to the Lord. The tax collector, on the other hand, would not even look up, but beat his chest and begged God for God to have mercy on him, a sinner. Well, the Gospels also record numerous accounts of Jesus healing people on the Sabbath day. He healed a man with a withered hand, a leper, and a blind man, just to name a few. Once again, the Pharisees were upset with Jesus because according to their laws, no one could receive medical attention on the Sabbath. Their hearts were clearly not in the right place. They were more concerned about the letter of the law than the people and their needs. I find it very interesting to note how the people were drawn to Jesus because of the stark contrast between him and the religious leaders. They talked about loving God, but Jesus lived it by his actions. In fact, there was a time in Luke 15:1 and 2, where the tax collectors and sinners were gathering around just to hear Jesus. They had spent time with him, and they knew there was something different about him. He was not like the other religious leaders. He showed that he cared about them by getting involved with their lives and talking with them. All the Pharisees could do in the situation was to mutter to themselves about the fact that Jesus was hanging out with those sinners again. Besides just the tax collectors and sinners, we see how the multitudes were drawn to Jesus. They would often seek him out and follow him around. He would go away to a solitary place to spend time with the Father, and they would find him. There was something different about Jesus. We can see from Matthew 9:35 and 36 what that difference was. It says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Matthew 20:29 through 34 records Jesus being followed by a large crowd and two blind men crying out to him to have mercy on them and restore their vision. It says again that Jesus had compassion on them and he healed them. Again, Mark 6:30 through 44 talks about Jesus and the disciples going on a boat to a solitary place. But when the crowds recognized them and saw them leaving, they ran ahead on foot and got to the place they were going ahead of them. Well, instead of being upset, once again, Jesus had compassion on them. He began teaching them, and because they were in a remote place, he also fed them. In fact, this was the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew 15:29 through 39 records a similar instance where he had compassion on the crowds and fed 4,000 people. In this particular instance, the people had been with him for 3 days and had nothing to eat. He did not want to send them away hungry because he didn't want them to collapse on the way home, so he fed them again. There are countless examples over and over in the Gospels of Jesus teaching and healing the sick, the blind, the deaf, the mute, the lame, the leprous, those who were demon-possessed, and many others. In fact, John 21:25 says, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. Even though Jesus talked down to the Pharisees, he still had compassion even on them and on those Jews who refused to believe he was the Messiah. The week before his death, when he was riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, Luke 19:41 through 44 tells us that as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace." You see, Jesus' message of salvation was rejected by the Jews in order that salvation could come to the Gentiles. But it broke his heart that they would have to go through some awful times because of their unbelief. We can see this attitude carry over right up until the moment of his death when he was on the cross. In that moment, when Jesus became sin for us so that we could be made the righteousness of God, he had compassion once again on those who were mocking him, those who didn't believe him, those who put him on that cross. He looked down at them with compassion in his eyes and said to God the Father, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." You see, in one final act of ultimate love and compassion, Jesus gave up his very life for those who loved him and for those who hated him. Philippians 2 challenges us as believers to have the same attitude that Jesus had. Author Richard Blackaby says in his book, Putting a Face on Grace, that we as Christians have been shown so much grace. Because of that, we should be the most grace-filled people on the earth, but often we tend to be some of the most graceless, judgmental people. Perhaps before we are too hard on the Pharisees, we need to search our own hearts and take a deep look inside. Do we truly look at people the way Jesus did? Are we willing to hang out with sinners and love on them and get involved in the messy stuff in their lives the way Jesus did in order to build a relationship with them? Do we even look past our own lives and see the needs of the hurting, the lost, the sick, and those in need of healing and salvation? In closing, I want to repeat the definition of compassion that I shared earlier: mercy, kindness, or goodwill towards the miserable and the afflicted, joined with the desire to help them. My challenge to you tonight is to pray for God to give you a desire to help those who are hurting. If you ask God to bring you opportunities to show his compassion on others, he will bring people across your path. All he looks for are people who are willing to open their hearts to his leading. There are countless needs and opportunities out there. Let's be people who are ready to say yes and show compassion just as Jesus did. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the night.